Have you ever noticed that some narcissists don't become more dangerous when they're winning? They become more unpredictable when they realize they're no longer in control? Most people assume a narcissist is at their worst when they're openly criticizing you, giving you the silent treatment, or making you feel like nothing you do is ever enough. But psychologists who study narcissistic behavior often point to something even more revealing. The real shift begins when the narcissist senses that their usual methods are no longer working. The emotional reactions they once depended on begin disappearing. The arguments no longer pull you in. The guilt no longer changes your decisions. The attention they once received so effortlessly starts fading, and when that happens, their behavior often changes in ways that can seem confusing, desperate, or even completely out of character. This is where many people make a critical mistake. They see the sudden kindness, the unexpected apologies, or the emotional vulnerability and assume the narcissist has finally changed. After months or even years of emotional distance, it feels almost impossible not to believe that this could be the breakthrough you've been hoping for. But genuine change isn't measured by how someone behaves when they're afraid of losing something. It's measured by how consistently they behave after the fear has passed. That's why understanding these behavioral shifts matters. They're not necessarily signs of personal growth. More often, they're signs that the balance of the relationship has quietly begun to change. The first behavior is surprisingly simple. They begin paying attention to boundaries they once ignored. Think about that for a moment. For years, they dismissed your concerns. They interrupted your need for space. They criticized your decisions or acted as though your emotional needs were inconvenient. But suddenly, after you stop chasing them, after you become emotionally calmer, or after you begin creating healthy distance, they start respecting limits they previously refused to acknowledge. At first glance, this seems like progress, and sometimes it genuinely can be. People are capable of growth. People can become more self-aware. But the important question isn't whether the behavior changed. The important question is why. Did respect appear because they developed empathy? Or did it appear because they realized the old behavior no longer produced the result they wanted? That distinction matters because lasting character change grows from internal responsibility. Temporary behavioral change often grows from external consequences. The second behavior is equally revealing. They suddenly become intensely curious about your life again. Not in the relaxed, supportive way emotionally healthy people show interest. In a noticeably different way. They want to know where you've been, who you've spoken to, how you're spending your time, whether you've started seeing someone else, whether you're happier now than you were before. On the surface, these questions can sound caring. Someone watching from the outside might even think they're trying to reconnect. But pay attention to the emotional pattern beneath the conversation. Are they genuinely interested in understanding your life? Or are they trying to measure how much influence they still have over it? There's an important difference. Healthy curiosity celebrates another person's growth. Controlling curiosity quietly measures whether control is slipping away. That's why many survivors describe these conversations as strangely uncomfortable. The questions aren't always inappropriate. The intention behind them often feels different. Another behavioral shift appears when the narcissist starts bringing up old memories more frequently. Remember when we took that trip? Remember how close we used to be? Remember everything we've been through together? Nostalgia is a normal part of every human relationship. Healthy people revisit meaningful memories because they value shared experiences. But when someone repeatedly uses the past immediately after sensing emotional distance, those memories can begin serving another purpose. They become emotional anchors. Instead of discussing the present, the conversation repeatedly returns to a time when the relationship felt stronger, when your emotional investment was greater, and when their influence over your decisions was far more predictable. Again, this doesn't automatically mean manipulation. Context always matters. Patterns always matter. But when nostalgia consistently appears only after you begin moving forward, It's worth asking why the past suddenly became so important. Then comes one of the most confusing behaviors of all. The criticism becomes softer. Instead of direct insults, they begin offering concern. I'm just worried about you. I don't think these new friends really understand you. I hope nobody takes advantage of your kindness. Notice how different this sounds from open criticism. It's wrapped inside apparent care. That makes it much harder to recognize. Because if you question it, they can always respond by saying, I was only trying to help. Yet over time, these comments often create the same result. They encourage you to doubt yourself. They encourage you to question healthy decisions. They quietly pull your attention back toward their perspective. And that's exactly why this behavior deserves careful observation. Not because concern is unhealthy, because genuine concern empowers you. Manipulative concern quietly weakens your confidence. As these behaviors begin appearing together, many people feel something they can't immediately explain. The relationship suddenly feels different. The narcissist seems more attentive, more available, more emotionally invested. But beneath those changes lies an important psychological question. Has the relationship actually become healthier? Or has the narcissist simply recognized that the old methods no longer work? The answer rarely appears in one conversation. It reveals itself over time, because consistent character change has a rhythm that's impossible to fake forever, and the next behavior often exposes that difference more clearly than anything that came before. And the next behavior often exposes that difference more clearly than anything that came before. They stop acting as though they don't need you. One of the defining characteristics of narcissistic behavior is the appearance of emotional independence. Throughout the relationship, they may have acted as though your presence was optional. They gave the impression that if you left, someone else would quickly take your place. They dismissed your concerns. They minimized your importance. They behaved as though your emotional investment was something they could always count on, no matter how they treated you. But something changes when they begin sensing that your emotional attachment is fading. Suddenly, they become more available. They reply faster. They start conversations more often. They ask how you're doing without being prompted. They begin noticing details they ignored for months. To someone who's spent years hoping for this level of attention, it can feel like a dream finally coming true. But pause for a moment. Ask yourself one important question. Why did this behavior only begin after you stopped expecting it? Healthy love doesn't usually appear only when someone's influence is disappearing. It remains consistent even when the relationship feels secure. That's why timing tells you far more than promises ever will. There's another behavior that often surprises people because it looks remarkably mature. They begin accepting responsibility, at least partially. You might hear statements like, I know I wasn't perfect. I made some mistakes. I should have listened more. For someone who has waited years to hear those words, they can feel incredibly meaningful, and sometimes they genuinely are. Real accountability is one of the strongest signs that a person is capable of growth. But authentic accountability has characteristics that are difficult to imitate. It doesn't arrive only during moments of crisis. It doesn't disappear once the relationship feels safe again. Most importantly, it doesn't immediately shift attention back toward your mistakes. Listen carefully to what happens after the apology. Does it end with responsibility, or does it quietly become shared blame? I'm sorry, but you weren't easy to live with either. I know I hurt you, but you hurt me too. I've admitted my mistakes. Now it's your turn. Notice the shift. The conversation begins with accountability. It ends with negotiation. Instead of allowing responsibility to stand on its own, it becomes another way of balancing the emotional scales. That's very different from genuine remorse. Another revealing behavior appears when they suddenly become the person you've always wanted them to be. They become patient, attentive, supportive, affectionate. They remember small details. They compliment you more often. They make plans for the future. At first, this can feel almost unbelievable. You find yourself thinking, this is the person I always knew they could be. But there's a question worth asking. If they possessed this emotional capacity all along, why did it only become visible after they realized they might lose access to you? That's not a cynical question. It's a practical one. Because sustainable change isn't measured by intensity, it's measured by consistency. Anyone can maintain extraordinary behavior for a few days or even a few weeks when the stakes feel high. Character reveals itself in ordinary moments, not emergency situations. Pay attention to another subtle shift. They begin speaking differently about your independence. Perhaps they once criticized your hobbies, dismissed your ambitions, showed little interest in your personal goals. Now they suddenly encourage your success. They tell you how proud they are. They support your decisions. Again, this can absolutely be genuine. People do mature, people do grow, but ask yourself something deeper. Does their encouragement continue even when your independence means needing them less? Because emotionally healthy people celebrate growth, even when it changes the relationship. Someone driven primarily by control often feels comfortable supporting your independence only as long as it doesn't reduce their emotional influence. The moment your confidence becomes stronger than your dependence, the real test begins. Perhaps the most overlooked behavior happens in complete silence. Nothing dramatic is said, nothing obvious occurs. You simply notice they're watching. They view your stories. They ask mutual friends about you. They casually mention things they somehow know, despite having little direct contact. It's as though they're quietly checking whether the emotional connection still exists. Not necessarily because they want reconciliation, but because certainty has disappeared. And uncertainty can be deeply uncomfortable for someone who once believed they completely understood their place in your life. Here's what makes this stage so psychologically important. Many survivors become focused on interpreting every behavior. What does this message mean? Why did they suddenly unblock me? Why are they acting differently now? Those questions are understandable, but they can also become distractions, because the most important question isn't what the narcissist is feeling. The most important question is what you are experiencing. Are you more peaceful than you were 6 months ago? Do you trust yourself more? Are your boundaries stronger? Do your relationships feel healthier? Those answers matter far more than trying to decode someone else's motives. One of the greatest signs of healing is that you slowly lose interest in solving the mystery of another person's behavior. Instead, you become interested in protecting your own emotional well-being. That's when the balance quietly shifts, because your decisions are no longer driven by fear. They're driven by clarity. And clarity changes everything. It changes the conversations you tolerate, the relationships you invest in, the boundaries you're willing to defend. Most importantly, it changes the way you see yourself. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's attention. You stop confusing temporary affection with lasting respect. You stop believing that someone's sudden change automatically erases years of repeated patterns. And that's exactly where the final behavior becomes impossible to ignore. Because when a narcissist realizes that your peace matters more to you than their approval, they often face something they spent a very long time trying to avoid. The possibility that they've truly lost the control they once believed would always be theirs. The possibility that they've truly lost the control they once believed would always be theirs. This is the point where many people expect a dramatic ending. They imagine the narcissist suddenly admitting every mistake, begging for another chance, or finally recognizing the pain they caused. Real life is usually far more complicated than that. Some people double down on old behaviors, others search for attention elsewhere. Some attempt to reconnect, while others pretend the relationship never mattered at all. Human behavior is never identical from one person to another, but one psychological principle remains remarkably consistent. When a strategy no longer produces the outcome it once did, it loses its power. And that's exactly what happens when emotional control stops working. For a long time, the relationship may have operated on a familiar cycle. A disagreement would happen. You would explain yourself. They would withdraw. You would chase the conversation. Eventually, some form of reconciliation would occur, and the pattern would quietly begin again. After enough repetitions, the cycle starts feeling normal, even when it leaves both people emotionally exhausted. Then one day, you don't chase, you don't argue, you don't spend hours writing messages you'll never send. You don't abandon your own peace just to restore someone else's comfort. That single change forces an entirely different reality. Not because you've become cold, not because you've stopped caring, because you finally learned the difference between love and emotional dependence. There's something incredibly powerful about that distinction. Love allows two people to grow. Dependence requires one person to shrink. When you were constantly afraid of losing the relationship, you naturally accepted behaviors that never truly aligned with your values. You ignored your intuition. You excused repeated disappointments. You convinced yourself that if you were just a little more patient, a little more understanding, or a little less sensitive, everything would eventually improve. But healing changes the questions you ask. Instead of asking, "How do I keep this relationship?" you begin asking, "Does this relationship allow me to be myself?" That's a completely different standard. And once you adopt it, unhealthy dynamics become much harder to ignore. Perhaps the greatest fear for someone who relies heavily on control isn't rejection, it's irrelevance. It's realizing that the person they once influenced has discovered they can live peacefully without constant approval, reassurance, or emotional permission. That doesn't mean the narcissist is suddenly living in endless emotional torment. People respond differently. Some move on quickly, some become angry, some attempt to reconnect, some simply redirect their attention elsewhere. What matters isn't predicting their reaction. What matters is recognizing your own transformation, because that's the part you actually control. Notice how your life begins changing once you stop measuring every day by someone else's behavior. You wake up without immediately checking your phone. You make decisions without wondering how they'll react. You spend time with people who leave you feeling energized instead of emotionally drained. You laugh without feeling guilty. You express opinions without rehearsing them first. These moments sound ordinary, but together they represent something extraordinary: the return of your emotional freedom. Many survivors spend years believing confidence comes from finally saying the perfect thing to the narcissist. It rarely does. Confidence usually arrives much more quietly. It appears the first time you calmly maintain a boundary. The first time you say no without explaining it for 20 minutes. The first time you realize someone else's disappointment doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Those moments rebuild self-respect one decision at a time. Another lesson often surprises people. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You may eventually forgive someone for your own peace of mind. That doesn't mean trust automatically returns. Trust isn't rebuilt by promises. It's rebuilt through long-term consistency. Healthy relationships don't ask you to ignore repeated patterns simply because someone sounds convincing in the moment. They create safety through dependable actions, not emotional speeches. If someone genuinely changes, that change becomes visible over months and years. It doesn't appear only when they're afraid of losing access to you. That's why patience is so important. Not patience with unhealthy behavior, patience with the process of observing whether actions continue matching words long after the immediate crisis has passed. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson hidden inside this entire journey. The goal was never to make a narcissist afraid. The goal was never to make them regret losing you. The goal was never to win an emotional battle. The real victory is much quieter than that. It's reaching the point where your happiness no longer depends on someone else's approval, where your boundaries no longer feel selfish, where your kindness is guided by wisdom instead of fear, where you stop confusing attention with love and consistency with temporary intensity. Because once you reach that point, something remarkable happens. The relationship no longer defines your future. It becomes part of your past. The person who once had the power to ruin your entire week becomes someone whose choices no longer determine your emotional state. That's not revenge. That's recovery. So if you ever notice someone suddenly changing only after they realize you're no longer willing to sacrifice your peace, don't rush to interpret every behavior. Stay calm. Watch for consistency. Trust actions more than promises. And above all, pay attention to your own life. Are you becoming stronger, more peaceful, more confident in your own judgment? If the answer is yes, then you're already moving in the right direction, because the greatest sign that you've taken back your power isn't that someone else starts behaving differently, it's that their behavior is no longer what determines the direction of your life. And once you reach that place, you've discovered something far more valuable than control over another person. You've discovered lasting control over yourself.